I used to wonder, every year around Easter time, I used to wonder, why did the television people always seem to put the movie, The Ten Commandments, on TV at Easter time? I mean, what did Moses and his story in Egypt, what did that have to do with the story of Jesus and his death on the cross? I mean, apart from them both being stories from the Bible. What was it? Did the television people just think that Easter was a good time for religious content in general? What was going on? Well, I gotta tell you, it took me years to figure it out. But eventually, I cued in that every year, the Jewish festival of Passover, which of course celebrates the time that Moses took the people of Israel out of Egypt, happens more or less at the same time of Easter every year. And so actually what the television people were doing was, they weren't putting that movie up for the Christians, they were putting it up for the Jews. I finally figured it out. But surely that was just a coincidence. It was just a happenstance that these two festivals happened at the same time. Well, of course, it's not quite a coincidence. For one thing, of course, Jesus was crucified during the Jewish festival of Passover, which was no accident at all. Because, you see, Passover was a time of heightened political tensions in Jerusalem during the first century. This was because the Romans, you see, they had conquered Judea. And they had basically turned most of its inhabitants into literal slaves. And the rest were virtual slaves who only served Rome's interests. And, well, it turned out that the Romans got a little bit touchy during Passover time because, you see, their slaves were celebrating the time that their God had set them free from slavery. So there was a lot of political unrest. And so what the Romans did was, they tended to clamp down on people. And so the Romans tended to round up a lot of troublemakers at Passover time, and there were a lot of crucifixions. So it's hardly surprising that someone like Jesus might have gotten caught up in the annual roundup of troublemakers. But the connection between Easter and Passover is about more than just the accident of them happening at the same time. In fact, the early church, early Christians, found a great deal of meaning in the connection between Passover and Easter. And we find that in the Bible itself. In the Gospel writers, for example. As you probably have already realized, the first three Gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all begin their account of the suffering and the death of Jesus with a Passover celebration. And so Jesus and his disciples gather in an upper room where they eat a meal that is clearly intended to be a Passover meal. Now, only two elements in that supper are mentioned: the bread, which is presumably unleavened, and the wine. But the assumption behind that is that those are just two parts of a regular Passover meal. So the first three Gospel writers agree that was a Passover meal before Jesus was arrested. But chances are you never knew, or nobody ever told you, that the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, actually disagrees with the other Gospel writers on this point. According to John, that meal, the last meal that the disciples had together, wasn't actually a Passover meal. And that when Jesus was arrested, the Passover was yet to come. And so, for example, John tells us that when the chief priests and elders arrested Jesus and took him to Pilate, they did not enter into Pilate's house. Why? Because as Jews, if they entered into a Gentile's house, they would have become unclean, and they were worried, John said, They were worried that if they were unclean, they would not be able to eat the Passover meal. This would not have been a problem if the Passover had already been celebrated. And then in the passage we read this morning, John says in no uncertain terms that Jesus' trial before Pilate took place on the day of preparation for the Passover. That is to say, the day before, when people made all their household preparations for the feast. So we have an interesting disagreement here. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all insist that Jesus was crucified a day or so after Passover. Well, John is insisting rather forcefully, no, Jesus was crucified just before the Passover. Now, you might look at that and say, well, that's no big deal. I mean, we're just talking about a difference of a day or two. I mean, what's the difference of a day or two in the grand scheme of things? And of course, this is a significant difference. Because these gospel writers, they're all Jews. And all the people who remembered what happened to Jesus, they were all Jews, the ones who passed down the story. And for a Jew, Passover is the most important time of the year. I mean, just think of it this way. If you had a friend and something tragic happened to your friend at Christmas time, don't you think you would remember whether that tragedy happened before or after the 25th of December? And yet these Jews disagree on that rather important little fact in Jesus' life. Now, a lot of people down through, we've had centuries to think about this, so a lot of people have offered their solutions to this problem. Explanations. Some have suggested that what's going on here is that we've actually misunderstood the first three Gospels, and that if you get underneath what it says there, they actually agree with John. But other people looked at it and said, no, that's wrong. We need to understand John. We have misinterpreted John, and when we fix John, he then agrees with the others. And then there's another really interesting argument that's been made. Some people have suggested that there were different sects of Judaism at that time, and that different sects calculated the date for Passover differently. Just like Eastern Christians and Western Christians will calculate a different date for Easter today. So the suggestion is, the theory is, that within the discipleship group itself there were Jews who belonged to different sects and who believed that the date for Passover was different that year. So these are all kind of interesting explanations. None of them is overly convincing because obviously no one has latched onto one in particular. But the real problem with them is this. I think they missed the point. See, the real point in this is not this whole question of what exactly happened when. It's not about that. All of this disagreement, all of this discussion among the early Christians is really about what those events meant to the early Christians. It's about meaning, which is far more important in their minds than the specific chronology of events. And while it might be true, it's probably true that, yes, that last meal that Jesus ate with his disciples was, in fact, a Passover meal, John apparently goes out of his way to tell the story in such a way as to make Jesus' death coincide with the slaughter of the lambs for the Passover feast. Now, such chronology doesn't really make sense in practical terms, but that's not what matters. This is John's way of getting a point across to us. And what he's trying to say to us is this: not only that Jesus' death coincided with the death of the Passover lambs, he wants us to understand that Jesus was the Passover lamb. That Jesus, in his death, finally fulfills everything that was anticipated and promised in the slaughter of the Passover lamb. That's what he wants us to understand. So there was a clear connection in the early church between Jesus and this Passover lamb, and John's not the only one to make it. In his letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul writes this: Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed for us, therefore let us join the feast. So what they are telling us is this: if you want to understand what Jesus' death means, you need to look at that ritual of the Passover lamb. So we need to do that. We need to look at that Passover lamb and understand its death and what it meant to ancient Jews, to understand what the death of Jesus means to us today. So what purpose did the slaughter of the Passover lamb serve? Well, it was killed, first of all, above all. Why? To feed the family. So that the family could gather together around that table and eat. Does Jesus provide for us nourishment? Absolutely. Jesus is for us spiritual food. He gives to us wisdom. He gives to us knowledge and understanding like we cannot find anywhere else in this world. More important than that, Jesus gives to us meaning and purpose in life that so many in this world lack. Jesus is our spiritual food. But of course, there was a second reason for why that lamb was slaughtered. The Jews did not eat the blood of animals, and so when the lamb was slaughtered, the blood was collected. And then we are told it was taken and used to mark the doorposts and the lintels of the house in which that Passover meal was eaten. A rather gruesome ritual in our thinking, but it was important to them. Now, this is explained in the Exodus story as this. God had sent his destroyer out over the land of Egypt. And God's destroyer was going out and slaughtering all of the firstborn children and firstborn animals in every household in Egypt. But there was a problem. Because apparently this destroyer had not downloaded all of the data from the latest census. And he did not know which household was a slave household and which household was an oppressor household. And so some means was needed to mark those households that belonged to the slaves so that the destroyer would pass over them. And that's, of course, where the name of the festival comes from, Passover. Now all of this imagery, all of this idea, doesn't seem very good to us. But you need to understand how they looked at it. They understood that the firstborn in every household, the firstborn child, the firstborn animal, the firstborn fruit from any fruit tree, in every religion in the world, in that part of the world at that time, there was a belief that that firstborn properly belonged to God, to the God who had opened the womb for it, who had brought it into the world. So as these Israelites looked at this story, they would have understood that what God was doing here was simply claiming what was already his. The firstborn in every family properly belonged to God. Anyways, God was just taking what was his. That's how they would have read the story. And I know it's disturbing to us because we tend to read it as a punishment story. You know, God going out and punishing the Egyptians. Punishing, and this doesn't seem very just at all to us, punishing them by killing the children. Even though, of course, the children are innocent, it is the parents who enslaved and oppressed the Israelites. But this was not the orientation of the people people who read the story. This was not the orientation of the people who celebrated this festival. It was not about the Egyptians for them. It was about that family. The people inside that house eating that Passover meal. And that blood on the door for them was a reminder. It was a reminder that every person in that household, I mean the eldest especially, of course, but every person in that household properly belonged to God. To the God who had opened the womb for them, who had given them life. And in some ways, I think that blood on the doorstep was a reminder of the blood on the entrance to the womb. Reminder of who had given them life. And it was a reminder, especially to them, that if they were alive, if they were free, it was because God had chosen not to take what was rightfully his. The blood on that door, therefore, is a sign and a mark of God's grace. A mark of God having full right to take whatever, and yet choosing not to. And that is exactly why the early church immediately, almost immediately following the crucifixion, made a direct connection between Jesus and that Passover lamb. Because for them, Jesus was the ultimate demonstration of God's grace. That Jesus, you know, the world had just thrown at him everything, had thrown at him rejection and violence and hatred and death, and yet Jesus had overcome it all with the supreme display of God's grace and love and compassion. And so they saw themselves kind of like those doorposts, marked with the blood of Jesus. What did that mark mean? It did not mean that they were any better than anyone else. I mean, that Jewish family inside that household eating the Passover meal was no better than the Egyptians. It wasn't about that. It doesn't mean that we're any smarter. It doesn't mean we know more than anyone else. It only marks us as people who have been marked by the grace of God. That God could demand from us everything, but chooses not to. That God has chosen to love us and forgive us and be compassionate to us, not because we earned it, but because we are marked with that blood. Jesus is the Passover lamb. His blood, his death, the ultimate illustration of what God's grace really looks like. And just as those Passover lambs were in the book of Exodus part of God's plan to gain for his people freedom, Jesus' death, Jesus' blood is part of God's plan to gain for us freedom from this dark world and the power it holds over us to pull and suck the life out of us, to make us hopeless and lost. The power of God made real to us. Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us join the feast. Let's take a few moments in silence.